For many centuries, Britain was a dangerous place.
It was a magnet for the very worst kind of people. Jack the Ripper dominated the headlines, but he wasn't the only killer around. Murder was afoot. The fear of death was everywhere.
But police had their work cut out to track the culprits down. In this series, we'll be investigating some of the country's most notorious and intriguing crimes.
Female defendant.
Sexual intrigue, vicious murder, as well as the latest technology, fed the nation's insatiable desire
For gruesome stories of Britain's dark side. The story of the Jigsaw murders centres around a stream in Scotland. Gardenholm Lynn, it is called. It was at this secluded and isolated place that in 1935 a gruesome discovery was made. But the story begins in Lancaster, the county town of Lancashire, situated in the northwest of England. It has a long and rich history, which dates back to Roman times. But in the modern era, the textile trade was its predominant source of income. By the 1930s, it had gone into decline. Nevertheless, the town was still populated with a strong, working-class community. It was here that the Indian-born doctor Buck Ruxton set up his GP's practice at his home surgery at 2 Dalton Square. He was young, intelligent, and well regarded by the town's population.
The GPs were pillars of the local community. It's before the days of the NHS, so doctors charged for their services and for the medicines they dispensed. And by all accounts, he was well regarded because when people couldn't afford the doctor, he didn't make charges.
Lancaster, with a strong working class community, is what suits Buck Ruxton. Working class patients are going to be grateful for a doctor and are not going to say, yes, but you're not white British. We don't want you.
I'm sorry to keep bothering you, Doctor.
It's quite all right.
Herbert insisted.
Always happy to see you, Mrs. Hampshire. 3 times a day, with water.
Thank you.
Please, I won't accept any payment for...
No, Doctor, I insist.
Mrs. Hampshire, I will not charge you for this consultation.
Thank you.
Now, if your Herbert has any more worries, any at all, I want you to come see me, yes?
Of course. We were saying only just this morning how we don't remember how we ever coped before you came.
Good day, Mrs. Hampshire.
Ruxton was a family man, living with his wife, Isabella, and 3 children, along with the housemaid, Mary Jane Rogerson. Buck and Isabella met in Edinburgh, where he was studying to be a surgeon. Edinburgh at the time was renowned for its excellence in medicine. It was also a world leader in forensic research.
He met Isabella reputedly when she was working in a cafe in Edinburgh. He seems to have been instantly attracted to her, and I suspect that she was equally attracted by him.
The two of them struck up a relationship. Eventually Isabella became the common-law wife of Buck Ruxton.
They are established as Dr. and Mrs. Buck Ruxton for at least several months before they manage to scrape together the money to purchase the practice based at 2 Dalton Square, Lancaster.
You're very kind, doing all of this for Mrs. Ruxton.
That'll do, Mary.
I'll go up then, looking on the children.
Thank you.
I thought you'd be in bed.
I made a supper. There's bread and butter, cake,
I've eaten, Bonnie.
stewed blackberries.
It's late.
I know, it is late. How were the illuminations?
It was a bit cold. Then Jeannie wanted to talk. You know how she is. I didn't mean for it to get so late.
I have barely seen you this week.
I'm home now.
Was Robert Edmondson there?
Why would you ask me that?
Well, you were both enjoying yourselves in Edinburgh last week.
He was there with his family.
You stayed in the same hotel. I saw the register.
You followed me. You were meant to have the children.
Sit down.
I'm going to bed.
I said sit down!
Buck Ruxton was born Bakhtiar Hakim in Mumbai, then known as Bombay in 1899. India at the time was under the rule of the British Raj. It was a country stricken with poverty and had witnessed great famine and outbreaks of plague and cholera. He was from a tight-knit community that placed a strong emphasis on a good education. He would have grown up learning English from an early age. Luckily for Ruxton, he was a bright academic boy. and was encouraged to study medicine. An arranged marriage followed, but he realized that his profession could be his way out of India. He was accepted into the Indian Medical Service, and this allowed him to move to Iraq before moving to London in 1926, where he was decommissioned and decided to settle. After London, he relocated to Edinburgh to study to be a fellow at the Royal College of Surgeons. He changed his name to Buck Hakim, and then finally to Buck Ruxton. He was untraceable to his family and also to his wife in India, for his affection lay elsewhere. Or so it seemed.
Life between Buck Ruxton and Isabella wasn't smooth. There would be times when Isabella actually left the marital home for a while. So I think you could probably say that their relationship was stormy.
On one occasion he said, whoever chastises the most loves the most. And certainly he did chastise sort of Isabella. They seem to have had numerous fights.
Whereas now we might expect the police to intervene, to consider whether or not Isabella was a battered wife, a wife in danger. There was none of that in interwar years.
With their children asleep just feet away, Ruxton had beaten, stabbed, and strangled Isabella. Killing the nanny would be just the first of his desperate attempts to conceal that crime. He bludgeoned Mary unconscious before asphyxiating her. Ruxton had removed a witness, but created another problem. Now he had a second body to dispose of. The doctor pulled teeth to confuse dental records. He removed his victims' fingertips. He scalped them. He cut off their eyes, their lips, their noses, their ears, and all other identifying marks on their bodies.
Of course, this created a lot of blood inside the premises. He apparently used the bath as the point when he actually dismembered the bodies.
He then treated the body parts as bits of flesh. He treated them as a butcher at that stage would have done, and rolled them up in newspaper.
Eventually there's something like 70 different parcels or items.
You have to remember that this was a man who had felt himself sufficiently equipped as a surgeon, so he very clearly had skills with a knife. If he was in a rage when he killed, he was cold, methodical, and careful when he cut up those bodies.
Thank you again, Mrs. Hampshire. We have the decorators in tomorrow. You see, we need it.
Mrs. Ruxton not home?
No. Blackpool still, with her sisters. I was wearing this when I cut my hand. I think the memory has quite spoiled it for me. Your Herbert and I are a similar build, I think.
Oh, no, Dr. Ruxton, that's too much.
I insist. Now, the waistcoat especially is in a bad state. I can have it cleaned?
No. It's the least we can do. Oh, such lovely material.
Now, are you sure you will cope with all this on your own? Mary is on holiday.
Of course.
She works so very hard.
She is a good girl.
I'd planned to do it myself, of course, but, well, opening a can of fruit.
You must be more careful, Doctor. Now, just point me towards the hot water and I'll get cracking.
The stairs were filthy, the rugs soaking wet. In the yard, Mrs. Hampshire found carpets, towels, and a shirt, all soaked in blood. An attempt had been made to burn them. Mrs. Hampshire swept and scrubbed. She couldn't get the carpets clean, nor could she remove the dingy yellow stain that ringed the bath. But she didn't suspect foul play.
I don't think you can blame Mrs. Hampshire, who wasn't familiar with the house, for not realising that she was helping clear up a murder scene. You wouldn't think of it. This was your doctor. Doctors don't do things like that.
Because she is not his regular cleaner, she won't know what is awry in the house, or things which, like the bath being discoloured. It's not something that she would know.
Doctor? I'll be off now. Doctor? Doctor? I'll be off now.
That's fine, Mrs. Hunter. Thank you.
There was only a certain amount of time before the wrapped body parts would start to rot and decompose. A stench he could not easily mask. Ruxton had to act fast.
On the 19th of September, 4 days after the murders, his chance came. Early that morning, he brought his car to the back door of Dalton Square. He carried the packages down from the top of the house, one by one.
He loaded his car with all the packages containing the body parts and drove north for more than 100 miles, crossing the border to Scotland, searching for just the right spot. He came to a bridge at a place called Gardenholme Lynn. The conditions could not be more perfect. In the days that followed the murders of Isabella and Mary Ann, Buck Ruxton maintained a semblance of normality. He took his children to school. He saw his patients in the afternoon, and he carried on the fiction of decorators coming to refurbish the house.
Ruxton told friends and patients different things about the absence of Isabella and Mary. To some, he said Isabella had gone to Blackpool. To others, it was Scotland or London.
You have to remember that murder is the rarest crime. So why would you automatically think a murder has happened in your midst?
People in Lancaster might have thought, well, it's impossible for a doctor to have been involved in a murder like this.
This is a woman who's frequently gone away. So why are you going to inquire? And I think there will have been, certainly amongst the kinds of people who might have inquired, a certain tactful reticence. Poor man, he's pushed it too far. This time, she's gone and left him.
He dissuaded Mary's concerned parents from going to the police. He claimed the young woman was pregnant, or had eloped with a laundry boy, or that she and Isabella had robbed him before running off together.
Ruxton's actions were hard to understand. Seemingly acting without thought, he went to the police himself and explained that his wife and maid were both missing.
He kept badgering the Chief Constable of Lancaster as to what was happening, asking whether they'd been found, and was presenting himself as the victim of a man who had been left by his wife.
He veers between sort of hysteria, wild fantasies. I mean, emotionally, he's completely out of control.
Although his erratic behaviour continued, Ruxton must have felt safe in the knowledge that he had dispatched the body parts in the raging torrent of Gardenholme Lynn. Surely by now they were mixing with the other flotsam and jetsam in the North Atlantic. However, Ruxton was unaware that on the night he threw the bundles over the bridge, a recent storm had caused the waters in the ravine to surge and flow furiously. But as quickly as the waters rose, they were soon gone again.
The packages were left scattered over the banks, waiting to be found.
On the morning of the 29th of September 1935, a young woman walking at Gardenholme Lynn spotted something. Looking over the parapet into the ravine below, she saw a bundle washed up by the water. The package had split, its contents spilling over the rocks. It was a human arm. The police were alerted. The gully searched. More packages were found, and more body parts. All identifying marks were missing, removed. They had no idea who the victims were or how many there were, and certainly no idea about the killer. The discovery soon made the newspapers, but as the police knew nothing, the press were left to create stories from very little factual evidence. This would allow Ruxton to think he'd got away with the perfect murder.
Here you are, Doctor.
Thank you, Mrs. Hampshire. Please, sit.
No, Doctor, I couldn't.
I insist. Smells just lovely. Did you read it?
It's dreadful, isn't it?
Medical experts declare that the bodies are those of a woman aged about 30 and a man aged about 50.
What kind of a person would remove people's skin like that?
As a medical man, it is just meat. You have to keep telling yourself that. It's not really a person at all. Hampshire,
Yes.
everything all right?
Will you excuse me, Doctor? I completely forgot. I need to check on Herbert.
Of course. Do give him my best.
Ruxton's confidence was misplaced. The remains were examined in the anatomy department of the University of Edinburgh. There, the bodies were reassembled and this time correctly identified as two women.
Today, DNA gives us the answer. That clearly did not exist in the 1930s. Indeed, even identifying blood as human was difficult.
What the forensic scientists were faced with was quite literally a jigsaw. They didn't know who they were. They did know that one was a woman in her 40s, the other was a woman in her late teens or early 20s.
One other thing that the pathologist and the medical expert realised was that they hadn't been cut off with an axe or a saw. Each part had been disarticulated, and that wouldn't have been possible unless somebody had had medical knowledge.
Police had another clue as well. Stuffed in one bundle was an edition of the Sunday Graphic newspaper from 2 weeks earlier. It was a special edition sold in just one part of the country, the towns and villages surrounding Lancaster.
Ironically, the Sunday Graphic was almost certainly got in for Isabella's tastes and Mary Jane's tastes. It's not the title that you would expect Buck Ruxton to read. The title says it all, Sunday Graphic.
Scotland Yard went round to the headquarters of the Sunday Graphic and spoke to the circulation manager, and he said what they called the slip edition involving the Morecambe Carnival. There was 3,700 copies printed.
Now, the Sunday Graphic was also not one of the leading national titles, so it was easy enough to find the subscribers and to follow the trail.
It was distributed to 19 newsagents, and the newsagent who took most copies was a firm called Merrick's, based in Lancaster.
It was there the police focused their investigation. They soon heard about the disappearances of Isabella Ruxton and the nanny, for Mary's parents had finally reported their missing daughter. They then identified a blouse found with the remains as one of Mary's. The woolen rompers found wrapped around one of the heads were soon traced to the Ruxton household as well.
Mrs. Hampshire? Mrs. Hampshire?
Dr. Ruxton.
The suit. Mrs. Hampshire, this. My suit. You still have it?
It's upstairs.
What have you done with it?
Well, are you all right?
What have you done with it?
I've cleaned it.
You still have it. You must do something with it.
What do you mean?
Do something. Get it out of the way. Burn it. Burn it.
Burn it?
You must burn it. Yeah. Mrs. Hampshire, you must burn it. Promise me you will burn it, yes?
Right. All right, Doctor.
Good, good, good. It is not dignified, see? I realize that. It's not dignified for a man to wear another man's suit. The police are asking me about Mary Rogerson. You will stand by me, won't you, Mrs. Hampshire? You were always my favourite patient. Have I told you that? Always. My favourite. You will not go to the police.
No. Of course not, Doctor.
You're my only friend. Burn the suit.
Right from the beginning, knowing what they have seen and know what they have heard, he is number one suspect.
The case, to my mind, is a great example of really meticulous, detailed work by the experts, but also the other professionals involved in the investigation.
It was widely known that Mrs. Ruxton had disappeared, and so had Mary Jane Rogerson. All of a sudden, the disappearance becomes extremely sinister.
But Ruxton realised that his arrest was going to be inevitable, and he made every effort to protest his innocence.
The police were gathering more and more evidence, all of which pointed to Ruxton. Saturday, the 12th of October, 1935, was his last day of freedom. Murder is easy. It's the body that's the problem. This was the issue faced by Buck Ruxton. The small mistakes he made were enough for his whole story to begin to unravel. Murderers will never learn, though. 14 years after the deaths of Isabella and Mary Jane, another body was being hacked up by a different killer, who then faced the same problem as Ruxton. Warren Street in the centre of London was the home of the used car trade in the city. It was a cutthroat business, and anyone uninitiated in the motor trade could find themselves driving away in a vehicle which may not get them past the suburbs. In 1949, one of the dealers who operated there went missing. His name was Stan the Spiv Setti. 2 weeks after he disappeared, a dismembered body was found half submerged in mud at the Essex marshlands. Headless and rotting, the body was almost unidentifiable. But advances in fingerprint technology meant a print could still be lifted from the sagging, waterlogged skin. Having identified Setti, the investigation picked up and a suspect was tracked from marked money known to have belonged to him. It was a man known as Donald Hume, a shady business associate of Setti. It would seem that an argument at Hume's house on Finchley Road between the two spiraled out of control. Hume stabbed Setti in the ribs 5 times with an SS dagger. The next day, he hacked the body into pieces, rolled it in a carpet along with some bricks, and hauled it into his car. He then drove to Elstree Airport, where he hired a light aircraft. He placed the body in the plane and took off. The plan was to drop the body in the English Channel. But after a couple of unsuccessful attempts, Hume must have panicked. Thinking he was still over the channel, he dropped the body in the marshland. Hume was soon tracked down. He concocted a false story about 3 men who had actually killed Setti, and that all he was doing was disposing of the body. The jury found him guilty as an accessory after the fact, and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Getting out after serving only 8, he took advantage of the double jeopardy law and sold his story to the Sunday Pictorial, pronouncing, "I, Donald Hume, do hereby confess to the Sunday Pictorial that on the night of October the 4th, 1949, I murdered Stanley Setti in my flat in Finchley Road, London." Like Hume, Ruxton killed in the heat of the moment. He chopped up his victims, and he miscalculated the suitability of the location to dispatch the body. Ruxton thought he'd done everything to cover his tracks, but the police were closing in.
Dr. Ruxton.
Good afternoon, Doctor. This is Captain Van.
Yes, Captain. Yes, of course. I was just dealing with a patient. I apologize. How are you? Has there been any news?
No. Well, I was hoping you might be able to assist us further. Could you come in?
To the police station?
This afternoon.
I have some appointments, actually. Several.
This evening, then?
I work rather late.
So do we. 9:30?
9:30? Yes, that would be fine.
We'll send a car.
Mrs. Hampshire! Mrs. Hampshire! Are you there? Have you got the soup? Mrs. Hampshire! Did you talk to the police? Mrs. Hampshire! Mrs. Hampshire! Mrs. Hampshire! Mrs. Hampshire!
After hours of questioning, Ruxton was arrested early the following morning. He was charged initially with the murder of the nanny, Mary Rogerson. He denied it. Ruxton was held on remand while police inquiries continued. Dalton Square was searched. Evidence was seized. On the 5th of November, the doctor was charged with the murder of Isabella as well. To secure a conviction, it had to be shown beyond doubt that the bodies found in Scotland were those of Isabella and Mary. It was forensics that would make or break the case.
One of the very compelling features is the extent which the experts went to identify these women. It was extraordinarily complex and detailed.
Gelatine moulds are made of the feet. These moulds show that they actually fit shoes of Isabella Ruxton and of Mary Rogerson.
They get a photograph taken up to Edinburgh, and they use for the first time a photographic technique. Having pared back the skull, they superimpose Isabella's photograph on that skull and get a perfect match.
They could trace the profile of the bones of the skull, which completely matched the facial features that had been taken of her in real life.
They use not just the photographic recognition, they use maggot and insect evidence, because they can use that to work out how long the bodies have been there.
When we have a dead body, then insects will land on that body within particular periods of time. So a forensic entomologist will look at the samples of all the different insects around a body and will see what stage of their development they are, so that they can put a potential time interval between when these insects landed on the body and when the body was found.
If it had just been one thing, you'd have found it difficult to convince the jury. So all these small bits of forensics, cutting-edge forensics, are used.
The findings of the pathologists would seem incriminating enough, but the police also found compelling evidence at 2 Dalton Square.
Despite Ruxton's efforts, traces of blood were found throughout his home. On the stairs and landing where the murders took place, in the bathroom where he'd cut up the bodies. This was the overwhelming evidence presented to the jury when Ruxton's trial began in Manchester.
The forensic evidence was really important in securing the conviction, not least because it was so key in identifying who the 2 victims were. and thereby linking it back to Dr. Ruxton. He perhaps hoped that they would never be found at all, and certainly if they were found, they wouldn't be identified. It just emphasises how positive the work was done by all the professionals involved to get that identification and to gather the forensic evidence.
It's cutting-edge technology, and it's something that Buck Ruxton could not possibly have expected or anticipated.
For all the medical knowledge that Buck Ruxton had exhibited in dismembering the bodies was brought to justice by the better medical knowledge of the medical experts up in Edinburgh.
Buck Ruxton continued to deny the charges and maintained his innocence throughout the trial. But with Mrs. Hampshire's testimony and the evidence from other witnesses and forensic experts, the case was too strong.
After 11 days of evidence, the jury found him guilty. Ruxton was sentenced to death and hanged at Strangeways Prison in Manchester on the 12th of May, 1936.
Crowds gathered around awaiting news of Ruxton's death. But there were also protests, not against the execution of Ruxton per se, but against the death penalty as a legitimate form of punishment.
Days later, a newspaper published what it claimed was Ruxton's confession, sealed in an envelope to be opened only in the event of his death. The doctor wrote, "I killed Mrs. Ruxton in a fit of temper because I thought she had been with a man. I was mad at the time. Mary Rogerson was present at the time. I had to kill her." All the pretense, all the lies were stripped away at last. Behind the forensic puzzle and newspaper sensation was a familiar story of a jealous, controlling abuser who destroyed what he claimed to love.